Hi, we're in the pastor's study and we're doing our Benedict option series. We're in chapter 7 of the Benedict option, which is education as Christian formation. This chapter talks about education and spiritual formation, and it's paralleled in Strangers in a Strange Land, which is also chapter 7, where he talks about education. And then in chapters 3 and 4 of Out of the Ashes, this same subject is addressed. So it's really important, if you're reading all three of the books, that you look at chapter 7 in both the Benedict option and Strangers in a Strange Land, and in chapters 3 and 4 in Ashes. I'm going to try to give you some basic information related to what the chapter's about. I want you to read it for yourself. But each of the authors, really in their own way, make an argument that children, Christian children in the religious tradition, need to have what is called a properly ordered education. We need to think about what that means, properly ordered education. For Jews and Christians, a properly ordered education is one where spiritual formation and all other aspects of development are synchronized as a whole. Now, this is described in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verse 52, in reference to Jesus when it says, "And Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men." This idea of him increasing in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man means that a properly ordered education is holistic development of the body and the mind in religious and cultural or social context. Now, these things for children should be done in a syncretized way so that the physical development, the mental development, the spiritual development, the social development, all of these things operate in a holistic manner. A convert has to go through a asyncretistic form because they've already developed in all ways except the spiritual, and the spiritual now has to be what we call transformation, not formation, transformation. And then for many of us in this culture, because we weren't properly formed or transformed, we really need to go through what I call spiritual reformation. That is part of that. We're not going to talk about that now. I just want to mention it so that you're aware. We're really talking about the spiritual formation of children. Now, the foundational education of our children must be the scriptures and the Judeo-Christian understandings and traditions based on the Bible. Integrated into that should be the historical Western cultural tradition, because that's where we find ourselves. And we fail this process if we miss the proper relationship between these two. So the heart of education is the religious knowledge, values, and skills that make us citizens of the kingdom of heaven. And included in this religious literacy is a cultural literacy that's found in the great books of Western civilization and the liberal arts education tradition that has served us so well in Western culture. Cultural literacy without religious instruction will assimilate our children, and that's what's happening to a great extent. Our children are getting a full education of the culture, and they are getting a Sunday school religious knowledge. That will not work. So we have to be careful of cultural literacy without religious instruction, because that is the road to assimilation. On the other hand, religious instruction without cultural literacy will make our children ignorant of the context of their own national history, and they'll become easy prey to those who are attempting to revise that, as we are seeing in the present context of our culture. So, a properly ordered education builds the identity of the person around their Judeo-Christian faith with full knowledge of the scriptures, their own religious tradition and the adjacent religious traditions within Christianity and Judaism that inform and assess their knowledge of a greater part of the religious community. And then that is integrated in proper relationship with the historical Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, European American culture that has developed and that we are a product of. So each of the books make an argument for leaving the public schools. All three of the books argue against participation in the public school system. Now, the reason for this is in the last 70 years, the public schools have moved from a curriculum that included a significant amount of biblical knowledge, skills, and values to one that's been purged of that content, and in many cases, replaced with a content that is hostile to Judeo-Christian faith and values. There was a book in education written by a man named Hirsch and called Cultural Literacy, and he argued that at least 40% of historic American history and education was biblical knowledge and content. And that, to a large extent, has now been purged out of the curriculum. In addition, in the last 50 years, the teaching of Western civilization has been revised to distort the actual history and the context so that past generations are no longer judged in their historical context, but by postmodern standards of feelings. And we see this in recent times in the discussions of statues and flags and labeling of hate group status to those who actually are hate groups and those who are just disliked. It's unlikely that Christian children are going to survive the mind programming that passes for education in many school districts in the country. And so the argument that these guys are making is that we need to leave the public schools. I was raised in the public schools, though that was a long time ago, and a lot of the content was there. And even when they moved some of the religious content out, they made it available with release time education. My children went to public schools, but we have a strong home that would give them the religious context, and I was able to teach the integration part. But as my granddaughters and grandchildren are going to schools, we're finding it more and more difficult for the public schools in some areas of the country to be useful. So there really is an argument for options. So what are those options? Well, one option are the religious schools, parochial schools. Now, the Benedict option warns that many Christian schools are poor choices, both religiously and culturally. The need to be accredited causes the public tail to wag the religious dog, and often the child gets an inferior education religiously and culturally in these schools. And I've seen this firsthand, where the religious education is just awful. Just awful. It's just trying to get the little children to accept Jesus, and that's it. And really poor understandings of the faith. And the actual education from a cultural perspective is not fully addressed, and the children grow up largely ignorant of a lot of the history and culture that they're a part of. Now, there are exceptions among evangelical schools, and there are good Catholic schools and Jewish schools that focus on religious and liberal arts education as a goal of character and civil competency. And so I'm not ready to completely throw out the public schools, but you must be actually involved, and you must know that that school is going to be sensitive to your issues. Now, if you're on the coast of California, the West Coast or the East Coast, that becomes more and more difficult as you move to the center of the country. There are areas where the school systems, the public school systems, still, in some sense, honor both traditions. But where that isn't the case, you want to be careful with even the religious schools. Now, the Benedict option also gives us this notion of the classic Christian school, and his suggestion is that congregations or groups of Christians should use the existing classic Christian schools or form their own. Now, the idea of a cooperative school is becoming popular among parents who have experienced the problem of public and substandard religious schools firsthand. And I think this is a real option, a way where we reform our congregations to also house for our children. And this works well for the Disciple Center because being a private congregation, we're not open to just anybody, but our members' children can cooperate together. The parents can cooperate together to form that kind of a school. That's a viable option that I think many believers have. The other option is homeschooling. And that may be, in some cases, a last resort if these other things aren't available. This has many advantages, but it also has some inherent problems. Curriculum can be a problem. Teaching skills of some parents simply are not there, and that may actually be a step backwards. The biblical norm for religious education was supposed to be the parents, with the primary responsibility on the fathers. But we're in a crisis where religious literacy among Christian parents is at an all-time low, and we must do remediation of them. And so this is problematic. You can't teach what you don't know. And many of our parents simply don't have teaching skills. And we have to give them those. But in the meantime, we have to find a way to raise the next generation. If we're just remediating the parents, the next generation grows up and then they have to be remediated. So we have to work on that. And I think that's something that the Disciple Center congregation is going to need to discuss. We have people who have done homeschooling, some in parochial schools, some in public schools. We need to discuss among ourselves the best way for our congregation to make available a classic Christian education or a properly ordered religious education to our children. So all of the books talk about higher education, which is also problematic for Jews and Christians. As secular universities ignore or mock religious worldviews and Christian perspectives on science, social science, the humanities, and the arts, that becomes more and more of a problem. In addition, religious schools are under incredible pressure to secularize in order to receive grants, accreditation for professional programs, and educational tuition funded by state and federal sources. This is going to continue and force most religious institutions to conform to what the secular universities do or find alternative funding and accreditation. And that's not easy. So the battle for the mind of our children and for our religious communities is really a battle of education. Understanding truth and knowledge within a biblical worldview forms our identities, forms the way we treat people, and reinforces our community standards under the kingdom of God while we are in the world but not of it. So there is much for us to consider in this area, and I hope you'll read these chapters very carefully and think about them and talk about them in your homes and among your friends so that we can have a fuller conversation about it at the Disciple Center. Now we're going to move on to the next chapter, and I will do that one. Well, let me quickly mention it. Our next area to go into is the idea of hard labor. This is related to the idea of education because our educational programs are predominantly pushing people towards licensed and accredited based professional programs. And one of the things we need to rethink is the trades and other forms of subsistence. We'll talk about that in the next time. So until then, I hope you have a good day, and we'll see you in the next session.